There are stories so old that even the stones seem to whisper them. Tales that begin not with certainty, but with shadows, with the sound of water running through the mists of time, and with two infants abandoned by fate lying at the edge of a river that would one day divide the ancient world in two. Their names were Romulus and Remus. Before there was Rome, before the legions, before the marble, before the idea of empire itself, there was this: a she-wolf, her breath heavy with wildness, bending down to feed the helpless. Blood, milk, and myth mixed on her tongue. From that savage cradle rose a civilization that would teach the world how to build, how to conquer, and how to dream. But let us begin with a truth that Rome understood from the very start. Every empire is born in violence, in chaos, and in contradiction. The Romans never hid from this. They enshrined it. Their first king murdered his own brother and called it destiny. In that act, the world saw what Rome would forever stand for: the belief that order can only emerge from the blood of disorder. Empires. Historical welcomes you. Today, we step into the river of beginnings, into a world that never stopped shaping ours. This is the birth of Rome. And before we dive deeper, take a moment to subscribe to Empire's Historical, to walk with us through the ruins, the legends, and the forgotten whispers of the civilizations that built our world. Every subscription gives strength to the story and keeps history alive. Now, let the journey begin. The story of Rome is not one of inevitability. It is the story of improbable survival, of a tiny community of hill farmers surrounded by enemies, hemmed in by forests and superstition, and yet somehow destined to rule the known world. When we look back across 3,000 years of dust, it is tempting to see Rome as a straight road, clear, inevitable, unstoppable. But in truth, Rome was never a straight line. It was a crooked path, carved through failure, betrayal, and resilience. In the beginning, Rome was nothing but a handful of tribes clinging to the muddy banks of the Tiber. They were not born to greatness. They built it, piece by piece, with calloused hands and relentless will. The Romans began with no empire, no gold, no heroes. Only the idea that to endure was to prevail. What made them different was not divine favor, nor the gods of Olympus, nor even the wolf that fed their founders. It was something far more human, an obsession with structure, with discipline, with control, over land, over enemies, over themselves. When other peoples of Italy quarreled, the Romans organized. They built alliances out of necessity, invented laws out of fear, and found unity where others found only rivalry. To them, chaos was not an obstacle, it was raw material, and they shaped it with the precision of engineers and the fervor of believers. The city of Rome began as a fortress, not of stone, but of will. Its walls were made of vows, its streets of promises. It was not yet the capital of the world, but already it was something greater than its surroundings, a symbol of endurance in a landscape of decay. The Romans were surrounded by older civilizations, the Etruscans to the north, the Greeks across the sea, the Carthaginians further west. They borrowed, shamelessly, Greek gods, Etruscan engineering, Phoenician commerce. Rome was not born pure. It was a masterpiece of imitation. Yet, through imitation, it found identity. Like a mosaic built from fragments of others, it created an image entirely its own. If the Greeks dreamed of beauty and truth, the Romans dreamed of permanence. Their genius was not in invention, but in construction, in building systems that lasted longer than the men who conceived them. In the Roman mind, immortality was not something you prayed for, it was something you built. And so, the small settlement by the river began to evolve. The muddy fields became streets, the huts became temples, and the people, once peasants, began to call themselves citizens. But citizenship in the Roman sense was never just a privilege. It was a pact. It demanded service, loyalty, and sacrifice. Rome taught its people that identity was earned, not given, that to be Roman meant more than living within her walls. It meant belonging to something greater than blood, greater even than nation. An idea. An idea that said, we endure because we are united. The early centuries of Rome were marked not by peace, but by struggle. Not just against neighboring tribes, but against itself. Each war, each defeat, each betrayal forced the Romans to rethink what it meant to exist. They learned to adapt, to absorb. Every enemy they fought left a scar, but also a lesson. The Romans learned from the Etruscans how to build, from the Greeks how to govern, and from their enemies how to survive. They transformed defeat into education, every setback a rehearsal for greatness. In that sense, Rome was never merely a city, it was a process. A living mechanism that grew stronger through pain. And through that process, something astonishing happened. A civilization emerged that was neither entirely Greek nor wholly barbarian, but something new, something Roman. It is here in this transformation that the true brilliance of Rome began to show. Because where most civilizations drew lines to exclude, Rome built bridges to include. The people they conquered were not simply defeated. They were invited, carefully, strategically, sometimes reluctantly, to become part of the Roman system. This was the seed of something revolutionary. Rome invented the idea that you could be a Roman without ever setting foot in Rome. Citizenship, once sacred and exclusive, became a political weapon and a dream. This was not kindness, it was genius. By extending identity to outsiders, Rome neutralized rebellion. The conquered began to see themselves reflected in their conquerors. To be Roman meant to belong to the winning side of history. And yet, that same inclusivity carried a quiet poison. Because if anyone could be Roman, then who truly was? The myth of Rome's founding, with its fratricide, its divine wolf, its blood and its milk, was more than legend. It was the template of an empire that would forever oscillate between violence and virtue, between chaos and order. Romulus killed his brother and called it destiny. Centuries later, the empire he founded would kill whole nations and call it peace. The Romans understood, better than anyone, that power demands sacrifice. That civilization is built not upon love alone, but upon the bones of necessity. But there was another truth lurking beneath the marble, one the Romans themselves might not have seen. Every time they extended their hand to an enemy, every time they absorbed a culture or granted citizenship, they were not just conquering others, they were transforming themselves. Rome, more than any empire before or after, grew by inclusion. Its heart beat in many tongues, its gods wore many faces, its people carried many colors. It was both oppressor and liberator, destroyer and builder, a paradox so vast it could contain the world. It is said that Rome's founders came from exile, wanderers cast out by fate. Perhaps that is why, even at its peak, Rome never forgot what it meant to be an outsider. It built an empire not only of conquest, but of belonging, an empire that promised order to a world drowning in chaos. That promise, though born in blood, remains one of the most seductive in history, the dream of unity, of law, of civilization that can outlast mortality. But do not be deceived by the marble and the myth. Beneath every triumphal arch lies the shadow of those crushed beneath it. For Rome, greatness was never free. Every road they built, every law they wrote, every victory they celebrated, all were paid for in sweat, tears, and the silence of the conquered. Still, there is a strange nobility in that silence, because from the ruins of those who fell before Rome, something transcendent emerged. The idea that from disorder, we can build order, that the world can be made to make sense if only we are willing to fight for it. It is this belief, part faith, part arrogance, that turned a river village into an empire. And as we stand now, 2,000 years later, amid the echoes of that empire's fall, we are still haunted by the same question Rome asked at its birth. Can power and virtue ever coexist? The Rome that began with two brothers and a wolf became an empire of laws, armies, and dreams. But in its earliest days, it was simply a story about who we are, what we fear, and what we might become if we dare to seize destiny with both hands. The story of Rome is the story of us, of our ambition, our cruelty, our brilliance, and our endless desire to make meaning from chaos. Every empire that came after, from the British to the American, has, in some way, been chasing the ghost of Rome, trying to replicate the impossible balance between civilization and conquest, between unity and control. And yet, the most Roman thing we can do is to question whether such balance can ever truly exist. So when you hear the name Rome, don't think only of marble and emperors. Think of the river, the wolf, the murder of a brother, the unquenchable desire to build something eternal, and the inevitable cost of trying. Because that is where empire begins, not in glory, but in struggle, not in perfection, but in survival. And somewhere, deep within that survival, lies the flicker of an idea that still refuses to die. That we too can rise from the wilderness and build a world that will outlast us. That is the mythic dawn of Rome. That is the first heartbeat of empire. Stay with us as Empire's Historical continues this journey, from the wolf's den to the marble halls of Caesar, from the birth of an idea to the fall of a world. The story of Rome has only just begun. Power is rarely born. It is built, not in a single moment of lightning and glory, but in the slow, grinding rhythm of discipline, ambition, and fear. After Rome's mythic dawn, when the blood of its founders had barely dried, the small city by the Tiber looked outward, hungry, restless, and certain that survival meant conquest. The early Romans lived surrounded by enemies, the Sabines, the Etruscans, the Samnites, each tribe as fierce and determined as the next. Yet where others fought for pride, Rome fought for permanence. Its wars were not eruptions of chaos. They were acts of construction. To the Roman mind, conquest was never merely about victory. It was about architecture, the building of systems, alliances, and obligations that could outlast the battlefield. They were not the first to fight for land, but they were the first to realize that land alone was never enough. Territory could be lost, armies could be destroyed, but the idea of Rome, the invisible web of loyalty and law, could endure even when the city itself trembled. So Rome did something no one had done before. It built an empire not through annihilation, but through absorption. When the Romans defeated their neighbors, they did not exterminate them. They studied them, incorporated them, learned from them. Each conquest became an education. The Etruscans taught them engineering and ritual. The Samnites taught them endurance in the mountains. The Greeks gave them art, rhetoric, and philosophy. Rome was never afraid to steal brilliance. It considered imitation a form of victory, and through this ruthless borrowing, they became something entirely new. From their earliest wars, Rome's genius lay not in cruelty, but in administration. They did not simply conquer people, they organized them. The conquered became subjects, allies, or even, in time, citizens. Each level came with duties and privileges, carefully calibrated to reward obedience and punish rebellion. It was a system so intricate and self-reinforcing that it made conquest its own justification. To resist Rome was to risk destruction. To submit was to be elevated. By offering a place within their system, the Romans achieved what no other ancient power had managed. They turned enemies into partners. The Italian peninsula, once a patchwork of hostile tribes, became a single organism beating with one heart, the heart of Rome. This was the true revolution. Rome discovered that identity could be manufactured. A man could be born a Gaul or a Greek, a Spaniard or an African, and yet, through service and loyalty, become Roman. It was an idea so radical that it changed the very definition of empire. No longer was Rome merely a place. It became a condition of belonging. It began with the Latin League, then spread across Italy. The Romans granted a special halfway status called Latinitas, a Latin right that offered limited citizenship, legal privileges, and the hope of full membership. It was clever, seductive politics. To be half Roman was to glimpse the door to greatness, and few could resist stepping closer. Centuries later, this slow expansion of rights would culminate in the most audacious decree of all, the Emperor Caracalla granting citizenship to every free person in the empire. But that was far in the future. In these early centuries, the seed was just being planted, a seed that would grow into a system of belonging unlike anything the world had ever seen. To understand Rome's expansion, we must see it not as a series of wars, but as a process of integration. Every province, every frontier, was an experiment in how far human identity could stretch before it broke. When the legions arrived, they brought more than swords. They brought engineers, surveyors, and architects, the real instruments of empire. Conquest was followed by construction. Roads, aqueducts, temples, forums. These were not gifts, they were declarations. Wherever a Roman road cut through the land, it said, "Rome is here now, and Rome will stay." Across North Africa, in what is now Algeria and Tunisia, entire cities rose from the dust. Cities like Timgad and Tapasa, laid out in perfect grid patterns, their symmetry echoing the Roman obsession with order. These towns were more than outposts. They were prototypes, fragments of Rome replicated on foreign soil. Within a few generations, local elites spoke Latin, held Roman offices, and built libraries, baths, and forums to rival those of Italy. To walk through a Roman provincial city was to step into a mirror, distant yet familiar. The marble might have come from Africa, the columns from Greece, the labor from Gaul, but the idea was always the same: civilization, order, hierarchy, belonging. This was Rome's soft power, its invisible conquest. You could live thousands of kilometers from the Tiber and still wake up every morning to the rhythm of Roman life. The clang of the forum, the rush of public baths, the whispers of senators and traders in the market. Even those who never saw Rome could imagine it. And in imagining it, they became part of it. The genius of the Roman system lay in its contradictions. It conquered with violence, yet ruled with inclusion. It demanded loyalty, yet offered opportunity. It enslaved millions, yet told them they could, in time, become free through service. It imposed uniformity, yet celebrated diversity. Rome did not erase local cultures. It consumed them, digested them, and used their energy to sustain itself. Nowhere is this more evident than in the story of Quintus Lollius Urbicus, a man from North Africa who rose to become governor of distant Britain. Born far from the marble heart of the empire, he climbed through the ranks by discipline and brilliance, proof that Rome's machinery could turn provincials into rulers. In this system, merit and loyalty mattered more than birthplace. To serve Rome was to climb the ladder of civilization. To die for Rome was to achieve immortality in memory. The empire became a vast mechanism of upward mobility, and at its core was the promise of identity. But not everyone believed the promise. For every local aristocrat who donned a Roman toga, there were countless peasants and tribesmen who saw only occupation. Imperialism, no matter how polished, is never consensual. Beneath the marble, there was resistance, resentment, and silence. Yet even rebellion could not escape Rome's gravity. When enemies fought Rome, they often ended up becoming more Roman themselves. The weapons they used, the roads they marched on, even the languages they cursed in, all bore the mark of Rome. Perhaps that is the most haunting truth about this empire. You could resist it, but you could not ignore it. The expansion of Rome was not a story of sudden explosions, but of relentless momentum. Each victory fed the next. Each conquest paved the road to another. The legions became the arteries of empire, pumping blood, soldiers, merchants, citizens, across continents. At its height, Rome ruled from the sands of the Sahara to the moors of Scotland, from the Nile to the Rhine. Its boundaries were not mere lines on a map, but living frontiers, porous and alive, where cultures collided and identities blurred. On these edges of empire, extraordinary encounters took place. In Britain, a Syrian man named Baratus married a native woman named Regina, a freed slave. Their tombstone, carved with both Latin and Palmyrene inscriptions, tells a story more powerful than any battle. The story of love in the shadow of empire, of two worlds merging into one. Such lives, quiet, forgotten, yet deeply human, reveal the true scale of Rome's transformation. The empire was not just an army, it was a vast experiment in what it meant to be human in a world newly connected by roads and law. For the first time in history, millions of people from different lands shared a single legal and political identity. They were all subjects of the same power, bound by the same roads, judged by the same law. And that law, Roman law, would outlast the empire itself, becoming the backbone of Western civilization. But Rome's appetite for expansion carried a curse. The larger it grew, the more fragile it became. For every frontier stabilized, another faltered. For every city built, another rebelled. The machine that once brought order began to devour its own strength. And yet, even in its overreach, Rome revealed something profound about humanity. That the drive to expand is not only about domination, it is about meaning. The Romans conquered not because they hated others, but because they could not bear the emptiness of boundaries. To them, the world without Rome was chaos, and chaos demanded order. Their expansion was not purely military, it was psychological. It was the manifestation of a collective anxiety, a fear of being surrounded by the unknown. And in that fear, we can recognize ourselves. For even today, our empires of commerce, of technology, of culture echo the same hunger to organize, to civilize, to impose meaning upon disorder. Rome's roads were the veins of globalization long before the word existed. Its citizenship was the prototype of the modern passport. Its law was the skeleton of the modern state. Even its bureaucracy, so mocked for its rigidity, was a miracle of coordination, capable of governing millions across 3 continents without telephones, electricity, or the internet. But there was always a price. Every empire builds its monuments from the labor of the voiceless. For every forum, a quarry of slaves. For every victory arch, a field of bones. Rome's greatness was inseparable from its brutality, its organization inseparable from oppression. And yet, the paradox endures. From oppression came order, and from order came civilization. When we walk through the ruins today, the broken baths of Carthage, the shattered gates of Timgad, the silent streets of Pompeii, we can still feel the hum of that machinery. It was a world that believed in itself completely. It believed that the will of Rome was the will of destiny. Perhaps that is why, even after 2,000 years, we are still haunted by its architecture. Not just the stones, but the structure of its thought. The idea that if you build a system strong enough, it might defy mortality. Rome did not conquer the world by chance. It conquered because it understood something fundamental about the human condition. People crave belonging more than freedom. Rome offered both, or at least the illusion of both. It offered law in exchange for obedience, protection in exchange for submission, identity in exchange for surrender, and billions across centuries took the bargain. That was Rome's secret weapon, not its legions, but its logic. It made sense, and when something makes sense, it becomes almost impossible to resist. As the dust of conquest settled, the empire stood unmatched, the master of the known world. But inside that triumph lay the first hints of decay. The very inclusivity that had made Rome powerful would one day dilute its essence. The machinery of organization that had built its greatness would become the weight that crushed it. For now, though, the empire was ascendant, radiant, disciplined, invincible. From a city born of myth and murder had arisen the most extraordinary political experiment in history. Rome had not just conquered the world, it had redefined what the world could be. And the question that lingered in the air, then as now, was simple, terrifying, and eternal. What happens when there is nothing left to conquer but yourself? Every empire must eventually ask itself a question far more dangerous than war. What do we stand for? For Rome, that question became the crucible of its identity. Once the legions had conquered and the banners had been raised, the empire faced a new, more subtle battle, not over territory, but over meaning. To rule forever, Rome needed to build more than walls and roads. It needed to build Romans. It is easy to see empire in the ruins, the columns, the amphitheaters, the statues staring into eternity. But Rome's greatest monument was invisible, a shared imagination. The idea that to be Roman was not simply to be born within Rome, but to live by her rhythm, to think in her terms, to dream in her language. The empire's true victory was cultural, and culture, unlike conquest, could not be won with a sword. Rome understood that power built by force must be maintained by faith, not religious faith, but faith in the civilization itself. To belong to Rome was to believe in her order, her law, her superiority, her destiny. This belief became the invisible architecture of empire, stronger than marble, deeper than the foundations of any city. After the blood and chaos of conquest, the Romans began to shape their world into a mirror of themselves. In cities across the Mediterranean, in Gaul, Hispania, Africa, and the East, they exported not just roads and aqueducts, but the very grammar of civilization. Markets, forums, temples, baths, theaters, the daily choreography of Roman life was replicated everywhere, as if the empire were stamping its reflection onto the face of the earth. Yet this was not mere imitation. It was transformation. The Romans did not erase the identities of the conquered. They refashioned them, blending the old with the new until both disappeared into something greater. In North Africa, Berber and Roman blood mingled in the streets of Timgad. In the East, Greek intellect and Roman discipline fused into a single cultural bloodstream. From this mosaic, a universal Roman world emerged, one where a scholar in Syria could quote Virgil, a magistrate in Spain could enforce the same laws as one in Rome, and a merchant in Egypt could appeal to the same emperor as a senator in Italy. This was the miracle of Rome, not uniformity, but coherence. What held it all together was a single conviction, that civilization was a moral mission. To be Roman was not only a legal status, it was a declaration of virtue, a membership in a project of order. Even the word civitas meant more than city. It meant citizenship, the community of those who lived under the law and within the light of civilization. Law was the beating heart of Roman identity. The empire's rulers understood that legislation could accomplish what armies could not: the conversion of chaos into structure, the taming of difference into participation. In the Roman imagination, the law was divine, the visible expression of reason in a disorderly world. Every clause, every decree, every trial was a performance of civilization itself. In the provinces, to live under Roman law was to step out of darkness into light. It granted rights, predictability, the dignity of being seen by the state. And for the Romans, to export the law was to fulfill their destiny, to extend reason across barbarity, order across wilderness. But law alone was not enough. Law governs the body, culture governs the soul. And it was through culture that Rome reached into the minds of those it ruled. Education became a tool of empire. Young men across the provinces learned Latin, memorized Cicero, recited the myths of the founding of Rome. In learning to speak like Romans, they learned to think like Romans. The Latin language became both a passport and a prison, an entry into prestige, but also a subtle surrender of identity. And yet this exchange was not one-sided. The empire's vastness ensured that Roman culture was constantly being rewritten by its subjects. Local gods were renamed, reimagined, and adopted into the Roman pantheon. In Gaul, Celtic deities fused with Jupiter. In Egypt, Isis became the goddess of half the empire. Rome absorbed them all, claiming that its gods were generous enough to include everyone's. This, too, was political genius disguised as tolerance. By allowing local faiths to survive under Roman names, the empire neutralized the power of difference. People could keep their gods as long as they also bowed to the emperor. The message was simple. You may worship whom you like, but you must do so the Roman way. It was through such subtleties that Rome built its most enduring structure, the architecture of the mind. The amphitheaters taught discipline, the baths taught civility, the forums taught participation, the temples taught obedience. The daily rituals of life became small rehearsals of empire. To queue for bread, to vote in the assembly, to cheer at the games, all were exercises in being Roman. And what an intoxicating idea it was. To be Roman meant to be part of something vast and eternal, a civilization that claimed to embody reason itself. It offered identity, purpose, and belonging. It offered immortality through participation in an order that seemed destined never to end. Of course, this identity was also a mask. Beneath the order lay cruelty, and beneath the civility lay coercion. The baths were built by slaves. The temples were raised by conquered hands. The peace Rome promised was peace maintained by legions. But the brilliance of Roman civilization was that it made even domination feel like destiny. The empire's elites, in Africa, Gaul, Asia Minor, embraced Romanitas, the Roman way, not because they were forced to, but because it made sense. To resist was to live in the past. To join was to step into the future. The Roman identity became aspirational, a dream of progress, of sophistication, of belonging to the greatest system mankind had yet devised. And so the empire created its most powerful illusion, that civilization itself was Roman. To be civilized was to be Roman. To be Roman was to be civilized. It was a circle so perfect that few ever questioned it. Yet within this perfection, cracks began to form. Because when everyone can become Roman, the word Roman begins to lose its meaning. The very inclusivity that sustained the empire's growth threatened to dissolve its uniqueness. The citizens of Spain, Gaul, and Syria no longer looked to Rome as the mother of civilization, but as its bureaucratic center, distant, abstract, and increasingly irrelevant to daily life. Still, for centuries, the illusion held. In the cities, the mosaics gleamed. The libraries expanded, and the statues of emperors stood unblemished beneath the sun. The people wrote inscriptions praising Roman virtue, Roman justice, Roman peace. They celebrated the empire not as an occupying force, but as a shared identity that stretched across deserts, forests, and seas. In places like North Africa, local councils erected monuments to their scholars. Men like Flavius Vonius praised not for conquest, but for eloquence, for literature, for culture. Here, at the far edge of empire, Rome had achieved its greatest miracle. It had made culture itself the measure of power. No longer did one need an army to be Roman. One needed refinement, education, poise. Romanitas became not just a citizenship, but a performance, a style, a language, a way of walking and speaking that signaled one's belonging to civilization. The amphitheater replaced the battlefield. Rhetoric replaced the sword. The empire had learned that persuasion could rule where violence could not. But even as culture softened the edges of empire, the old Roman virtues of discipline and duty continued to define its core. The Roman citizen was taught that personal ambition must serve collective stability. The family mirrored the state. The father mirrored the emperor. Order began in the home, extended through the streets, and culminated in the law. This sense of duty, pietas, was the glue that held Rome together. It demanded loyalty to the gods, to the family, and above all, to the state. In return, the state promised meaning. Rome told its citizens that they were part of a story larger than themselves, a narrative stretching from the wolf's den to the marble forum. That narrative, more than any army, kept the empire intact. For centuries, the Romans lived by it. They built cities as if they would last forever. They carved their names into stone as if eternity could be recorded. And in a sense, they were right. Even after the empire fell, the story endured. Because the idea of being Roman had transcended geography. It had become a condition of the mind. We still feel its echo today. Every courthouse that cites Roman law, every republic that models its senate upon the Roman one, every city that measures its streets by the grid, all bear the imprint of a civilization that once believed it could outlast time. And perhaps it did. The strength of Roman civilization was never just its engineering or its armies. It was its understanding of human nature. Rome knew that people crave order more than chaos, belonging more than freedom, meaning more than pleasure. And it offered all three, wrapped in the language of progress and destiny. This is why the empire's identity could survive its own collapse. When the legions withdrew, the culture remained. When the emperors vanished, the laws endured. When the temples crumbled, the idea of Rome still stood, reborn in the Christian Church, in the Byzantine East, in the Renaissance West. To be Roman was no longer about citizenship or place. It was about a state of mind, to believe in civilization as salvation, to believe that chaos could be conquered not by gods, but by men who built, reasoned, and remembered. And yet, this triumph carried within it a warning. The same system that united millions also suppressed them. The same order that created beauty demanded obedience. The same civilization that brought peace to the Mediterranean coast also silenced the voices that questioned it. Rome's genius and Rome's tragedy were the same. It convinced the world that power and virtue were one. In that sense, the Roman identity was both a revelation and a trap. It gave humanity a vision of what it could achieve, but also a mirror of what it might become when greatness turns to arrogance and civilization forgets its soul. Still, even knowing the cost, it is impossible not to feel awe. For within that tension, between brutality and brilliance, domination and devotion, the Romans forged something immortal. A civilization that defined what it meant to be human in a world larger than any tribe, broader than any faith, older than any nation. Rome's true conquest was not of land or people, but of imagination. And it is a conquest that still endures, quietly, within us. Because to this day, when we speak of law, order, discipline, and civilization, we are still speaking Roman. To walk through the streets of the Roman Empire at its height was to walk through the world itself. Every face, every voice, every accent told a different story of conquest, migration, ambition, and belonging. In the forums of Carthage, one could hear Punic merchants haggling beside Greek philosophers and Numidian soldiers. In Londinium, across the misty edges of Britain, Syrian traders sold spices beside Celtic potters and Roman officials. Rome had swallowed the earth, and yet somehow, the earth had begun to digest Rome in return. What began as a city on a river had become a planet in miniature, a living map of humanity. Here, east met west, north met south, and gods from every language shared the same sky. No empire before had achieved such a scale of human mixture. The Egyptians had ruled, the Persians had conquered, the Greeks had colonized, but none had ever absorbed. Rome's genius was not to destroy the world outside its walls, but to draw it inward. It did not simply tolerate difference, it functioned through it. Across its vast territories, the empire became a laboratory of coexistence, not peaceful, not equal, but astonishingly interconnected. The legions that marched from the Rhine to the Nile were mosaics of identity themselves. Spaniards, Gauls, Africans, Germans, Syrians, all bound by the same oath, the same discipline, the same dream of citizenship. Rome did not ask them to forget who they were. It asked them to add something to who they were, a Roman layer, a civic skin that unified without erasing. It was this paradox, this ability to create unity out of plurality, that transformed the empire from a machine of conquest into a civilization. In the 2nd century AD, the Roman world reached its fullest breadth. Over 60 million people, spread across 3 continents, were governed by a single political system, a single currency, and, perhaps most remarkably, a single set of laws. But beneath that surface of order lay a symphony of diversity. a cacophony that somehow harmonized. Consider a day in the markets of Rome itself. The air thick with smoke and noise. A Greek physician arguing with an Egyptian priest. Jewish traders from Alexandria weighing silver beside Roman senators buying silks from China. African musicians beating drums near Persian astrologers predicting the fates of emperors. Latin was spoken, yes, but so were 100 other tongues. The city was a Babel, but one bound by rhythm, by ritual, by the shared gravity of the empire's idea. In this world, belonging did not come from blood. It came from participation. To serve in the legions, to pay taxes, to swear loyalty to the emperor. These were acts of identity, not mere duty. Each one tied a person to the Roman order. The empire's frontiers were not walls but membranes, through which ideas, goods, and people constantly passed. On the northern edge, in Britain, archaeological remains tell stories the written histories forgot. Tombstones carved in Latin bear names from Syria and Africa. One of the most poignant belongs to a woman named Regina, a native Briton, once enslaved, later freed and married to a man named Barates from Palmyra in modern-day Syria. On her gravestone, two languages meet: Latin, the voice of empire, and Palmyrene, the script of the desert. Regina, freedwoman of Barates, it says, alas, how much I miss her. Their love was not an exception. It was a metaphor. The empire itself was a marriage, imperfect, unequal, but real, between conqueror and conquered, center and periphery. And like all marriages, it required constant negotiation. Rome had created not merely a political structure, but a network of human lives intertwined beyond precedent. Soldiers who began in Numidia retired in Gaul. Merchants from Athens died in Spain. Freed slaves from Britain opened taverns in Antioch. The empire's bloodstream pulsed with movement, carrying stories and genes across oceans and deserts. Modern science confirms what ancient poets already sensed. The Roman world was not static. In the cities of Britain, DNA from across the empire can still be traced. Mediterranean, African, even Middle Eastern roots, preserved in the bones of people buried under northern skies. Migration was not an anomaly of empire. It was its heartbeat. In this swirling diversity, the Romans discovered something profound. That identity could be layered like plaster, each generation adding a new surface to the wall of civilization. Yet such diversity was not born of tolerance alone. It was born of necessity. Empire demanded movement. Armies needed recruits. Cities needed administrators, artisans, and builders. Trade needed ships and sailors. Rome's greatness was built on circulation of people, of ideas, of labor. And so, the world moved. From Spain to Syria, from Egypt to Germania, the empire spun its web. For some, this was liberation, the chance to climb, to learn, to belong. For others, it was exile. Slaves were torn from their homelands, gladiators brought from foreign soil to die before Roman crowds. The same roads that carried philosophers and engineers carried captives and criminals. The same ships that brought grain from Africa also brought chains from the east. Rome's inclusivity had teeth. It invited you in, but it also consumed you. Still, even among those who suffered under its rule, the empire's gravitational pull was inescapable. Many of the enslaved became citizens, their children rising to positions of power. Freedmen financed public works. Provincial elites governed provinces. The lines between conqueror and conquered blurred, then vanished. By the time of the Emperor Caracalla's decree in 212 AD, which extended citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, the transformation was complete. The world itself had become Roman, or perhaps Rome had become the world. This universality was Rome's proudest boast and deepest illusion. It claimed to have built a common humanity, but that humanity remained stratified. The emperor was still divine, the elite still few, and the poor still many. Yet for a moment, perhaps the first in history, humanity could imagine itself as one polity, one order, one vast conversation. The Roman imagination even reshaped geography itself. To them, the world was not a patchwork of foreign lands, but a great circle radiating from the city. Rome was the sun, its provinces, the planets. Beyond its borders lay chaos, barbaricum, the realm of the ungoverned, where neither law nor reason prevailed. But within the empire, under the law, humanity had form and meaning. In this worldview, the empire's diversity was not a threat. It was proof of divine order. The gods, it was said, had given different talents to different peoples so that together they might build the perfection of Rome. The Greeks contributed philosophy, the Egyptians mysticism, the Gauls courage, the Africans endurance. All parts of the same body, all limbs of the same godlike organism. But that unity came with a price, for to be included was also to be absorbed. Languages vanished, traditions were diluted, local heroes became Roman generals, local myths were rewritten in Latin. The empire's cosmopolitanism was dazzling, but beneath it lay a quiet erasure. Rome's diversity was not equality, it was hierarchy, masked as harmony. The provinces might produce emperors, Trajan from Spain, Septimius Severus from Africa, but their ascent did not change the system. The center still demanded imitation from the margins. And yet, imitation bred transformation. The African emperor who ruled from Rome changed how Rome saw itself. The Eastern philosophers who filled its libraries changed how Romans thought about God and soul. The frontier soldiers who defended its walls changed how it defined courage. Slowly, imperceptibly, the empire was remade by the very people it had conquered. It became, in the truest sense, a world within a world, not a monolith, but a mosaic. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, this mosaic glittered with complexity. In Antioch, Christian communities met beside pagan temples. In Carthage, Latin poets wrote African myths in Roman verse. In the Greek East, the cult of the emperor intertwined with the worship of local deities. The empire was a conversation, sometimes harmonious, sometimes violent, between hundreds of civilizations, all speaking through the same administrative tongue. No one embodied this synthesis better than the cities themselves. They were the empire's mirrors. From the red sands of Algeria to the marble coast of Turkey, cities rose like copies of one another, each with its theater, forum, and bath complex. But look closer, and the local spirit was still there. In North Africa, the mosaics shimmered with African light. In Gaul, the houses were colder, the courtyards tighter. In the east, colonnades curved in Greek elegance. Each city was Roman, yet not quite. This was Rome's true gift, the art of coexistence without uniformity. It showed the world that civilization could be plural, that power could be shared, and that belonging could extend beyond borders of birth or blood. And perhaps that is why, when we look back, we feel something almost modern in the Roman experience. It was the first globalized world, connected, mobile, interdependent, and endlessly hybrid. The Romans did not call it globalization, of course. They called it Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But it was peace bought with the surrender of autonomy, peace maintained by roads, law, and fear. Yet within that peace, life thrived. Ideas flourished, people mingled, cultures fused. And from that fusion came some of humanity's greatest legacies: architecture that blended Greek proportion with Eastern ornament, religions that merged Mediterranean ritual with Semitic faith, languages that evolved from Latin into French, Spanish, Italian, living echoes of empire. Rome had, for a moment, built what humanity still seeks: a world where difference does not destroy unity. But no harmony lasts forever. The same openness that gave Rome its strength made it porous. The same roads that carried goods and ideas carried enemies. The same fluidity that united the empire also loosened its center. As the centuries turned, the vast network that once pulsed with vitality began to strain under its own weight. The frontiers blurred. The legions grew restless. The sense of common destiny The soul of Rome began to fade. Yet even in decline, the empire remained a mirror of the human world, vibrant, contradictory, and alive. It was proof that diversity, managed with wisdom, could build greatness, but left untended, could dissolve it. When the empire finally fractured, its people scattered, but they carried Rome within them. The languages, the roads, the laws, the very idea that civilization could unite the earth. These survived long after the banners fell. Rome was gone, but the world it imagined remained. A world where an African could rule in Europe, where a Syrian could marry a Briton, where a Greek could teach in Gaul, where belonging was not about where you came from, but what you built together. It was, for all its flaws, the closest humanity had ever come to being one people. And perhaps, deep down, that is why the Roman Empire still haunts us. Because in its diversity, its ambition, its contradictions, we see a reflection of our own. It reminds us that civilization is not a finished monument, but a dialogue, a constant negotiation between difference and unity, freedom and order, self and system. Rome mastered that dialogue for centuries, and though it could not hold it forever, it showed us what was possible when the world, for a fleeting moment, dared to live as one. Long before the cross cast its shadow over Rome, the city belonged to the gods. Not one god, not even a pantheon, but a living multitude, a divine swarm that touched every act, every moment, every breath of life. The Romans did not believe in their gods the way we imagine faith today. They negotiated with them, traded with them, invoked them like officials in an invisible bureaucracy. Each had a role, each had a jurisdiction, and together they maintained the fragile equilibrium between chaos and order. To live in Rome was to live surrounded by divinity. The hearth fire burned for Vesta. The boundaries of the home were guarded by the Lares. The fields were watched by Ceres, the crossroads by Mercury. Even the door hinges had a spirit. To the Roman mind, the world was alive, humming with unseen power, filled with presences that demanded attention, ritual, and respect. Their religion was not about salvation, it was about stability. The gods existed to keep the state safe, to bless the harvest, to favor the armies. And Rome, in return, honored them with temples, sacrifices, and festivals so lavish they blurred the line between devotion and spectacle. Religion was public business, woven into the machinery of empire. To pray was to participate in politics. To sacrifice was to affirm loyalty. In this symbiosis between state and sacred, the emperor stood as the bridge. His authority was both human and divine, sanctioned by the gods and sustained by ritual. The empire's strength, its victories and peace, were all interpreted as signs of divine favor. To doubt the gods or to refuse their worship was not merely heresy, it was treason. Yet beneath this dazzling polytheistic order, the seeds of spiritual revolution had already begun to grow. As Rome expanded, it absorbed not only new territories, but new beliefs. Egyptian, Persian, Jewish, and Greek religions flowed into the veins of the empire, each bringing fresh gods and strange ideas. The result was a spiritual marketplace unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. In the streets of Rome, one could find temples to Isis beside shrines to Mithras, altars to Cybele beside chapels to Jupiter. The empire was a kaleidoscope of faith, its diversity both vibrant and volatile. For centuries, this multiplicity seemed to strengthen Rome. The state was tolerant, not out of generosity, but out of pragmatism. The Romans believed that every god was worth appeasing, every cult worth containing, as long as it bowed, in the end, to the emperor. "You may worship whom you wish," the empire whispered, "but remember who rules the world." But among the many foreign cults that took root in this soil, two would grow into something Rome could neither absorb nor control. The first came from the east, from the caves and deserts of Persia, the cult of Mithras. It was a religion of men, of soldiers, of secrecy and initiation. Deep underground in torchlit sanctuaries, followers gathered to reenact the god's myth. Mithras slaying the sacred bull, his blood giving life to the world. To the Roman soldiers stationed far from home, the story carried irresistible power. Sacrifice, loyalty, victory over darkness. The worshippers of Mithras did not defy Rome. They mirrored it. Their faith was discipline incarnate. Yet even their mystery cult could not fully satisfy the hunger that was growing across the empire. A hunger not for ritual, but for meaning. That deeper tremor came from another province, Judea, small and turbulent, a land that had resisted every conqueror. There, among the hills and dust, lived a people who believed in one God alone, invisible, jealous, omnipotent. For the Jews, the Roman idea of religion was incomprehensible, even offensive. They could not worship multiple gods, nor offer sacrifice to the emperor. Their allegiance was spiritual, not civic, and that made them a political threat. Decades of tension erupted into rebellion. Roman legions marched through Jerusalem, crushing resistance and destroying the Great Temple, the center of Jewish worship. To the Romans, it was another victory. To the Jews, an apocalypse. Yet in the wreckage of that world, a new faith began to take shape, one that would outlive both temple and empire. It began, as revolutions often do, with a story. The story of a man named Jesus, a rabbi, a healer, a preacher, who spoke not of empire or conquest, but of love, forgiveness, and a kingdom not of this earth. To his followers, he was the promised Messiah. To the Roman authorities, he was a disturber of peace. Crucifixion was the empire's message to rebels, obedience or death. But what Rome did not foresee was that this death would not silence his message. It would ignite it. In the years after his execution, whispers spread through the empire's underbelly. The man from Nazareth had risen. Death itself had been conquered. Salvation, not order, was now the promise. The idea was unthinkable, that a crucified criminal could be the Son of God, that the meek could inherit the earth, that empire itself was temporary and answerable to a higher power. For the Romans, this was madness and danger. At first, the new sect seemed insignificant, a minor offshoot of Judaism, but its message was portable, universal. You didn't need a temple, a priesthood, or a pedigree to join. All you needed was belief. And belief, unlike law or language, traveled fast. The apostles carried the word along the empire's roads and trade routes, across seas and frontiers. Paul of Tarsus, a former persecutor turned evangelist, wrote letters that would become the backbone of a new scripture. His words were clear, urgent, and subversive. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. In that single line, the hierarchies of the Roman world cracked. The empire that had built its identity on order and distinction, citizen versus foreigner, free versus enslaved, powerful versus powerless, was confronted by a faith that erased those distinctions. Christianity was not just a religion, it was a revolution of equality. And so, persecution began. Christians were hunted, imprisoned, executed. In the amphitheaters of Rome, lions tore them apart as crowds cheered. To the state, they were traitors who refused to sacrifice to the emperor, whose allegiance was to an invisible kingdom. To themselves, they were witnesses, martyrs, bearing testimony through suffering. Their courage in the face of death turned their faith into legend. Blood became the ink of their scripture. But persecution could not contain the movement. It spread like a contagion, carried by the very networks that sustained the empire: soldiers, merchants, slaves, mothers, and scholars. Within a few generations, the empire's greatest cities, Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, all pulsed with the quiet rhythm of Christian communities. By the time the 3rd century dawned, the Roman state could no longer ignore what was happening. Its own gods were fading, their temples half empty, their rituals hollow. The old religion had kept order, but it could not give comfort. The new one offered both. Then, from the chaos of civil wars and political decay, emerged a figure who would change everything: Constantine. His story, like Rome's, begins with blood and vision. In 312 AD, on the eve of battle against his rival, Constantine claimed to have seen a sign in the sky, a cross of light, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." The next day, he won. Whether the vision was real or not no longer mattered. Power and faith had found each other. Constantine's conversion was less a moment of piety than a masterstroke of politics. He understood that the empire could no longer rule by the old gods alone. It needed a new unity, one that reached beyond Rome, beyond lineage, beyond the fading cults of Jupiter and Mars. Christianity, with its promise of universal salvation and moral order, offered exactly that. In 313, he issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing the new faith. The persecutions ended. Churches rose where temples fell. Bishops replaced priests as voices of authority. The cross, once a symbol of humiliation, became the emblem of empire. But in embracing Christianity, Rome also reinvented it. The faith that had begun as a cry for spiritual equality became intertwined with imperial ambition. The church mirrored the empire's structure, hierarchical, disciplined, absolute. The emperor became God's chosen instrument on earth, and salvation became inseparable from obedience. Still, something profound had shifted. The axis of human history had turned. In the space of a few generations, the Roman world moved from a cosmos filled with countless gods to a universe ruled by one. The heavens grew quieter, but also more vast. The relationship between human and divine transformed from negotiation to devotion, from ritual to faith. For the first time, the divine was not merely above, but within, a matter of conscience, not ceremony. The temples of Jupiter fell silent, their columns crumbling under the weight of centuries. In their place rose basilicas echoing with new hymns. Statues of emperors gave way to images of saints. The old gods lingered in memory, in language, in art, in the names of the planets, but their world was gone. And yet, Rome itself endured. The empire of stone became an empire of spirit. The same roads that once carried legions now carried pilgrims. The same bureaucracy that had governed provinces now organized parishes. The same hunger for unity that had built an empire of law now built a church of faith. Rome had not died. It had converted. The transition from polytheism to monotheism was not merely a change in religion. It was a transformation of the human mind. For the first time, morality was universal. History was linear. Salvation was eternal. The gods of old had bound man to the cycles of nature. The new God bound him to a destiny beyond time. It was both liberation and loss. In the silence after the last sacrifice, something vanished. The intimacy of the old world, where every stone had a spirit, every forest a guardian. In its place came a vast and solitary cosmos, ruled by a single unseen will. Humanity had exchanged its chorus of gods for the voice of one, and found itself both exalted and alone. But it was this loneliness that gave birth to a new idea, that each soul mattered, that every life was known, that the infinite could dwell within the finite. It was an idea Rome had never understood, yet somehow made possible. For out of empire came eternity, out of conquest, compassion, out of Rome, Christendom. The gods were gone, but the dream of Rome lived on, now baptized, eternal, and reborn in spirit. Every empire begins with expansion and ends with exhaustion. But Rome's end was not a single moment. It was a slow unweaving, a fading of light that took centuries to dim. No city in history had imagined eternity as fiercely as Rome did, and yet no city has shown more clearly that eternity belongs to no one. By the 4th century, the empire that had once encircled the Mediterranean like a golden chain was fraying at every link. From the outside came pressure, tribes, migrations, invasions. From within came paralysis, corruption, division, disbelief. The machine that had conquered the world was now devouring itself. The legions, once symbols of discipline and unity, had become fragmented armies, loyal not to the state, but to their generals. The Senate, once the moral heart of the Republic, was a ghost of itself, dignified but powerless. The emperors changed faster than the seasons, each one proclaiming salvation, each one falling to intrigue or assassination. It is tempting to imagine this period as decay, as if Rome simply rotted from grandeur to ruin. But the truth is more complicated, more human. What we call the fall of Rome was not destruction. It was transformation, a shedding of skin, a rebirth through pain. The empire's first instinct, as always, was to control the uncontrollable. Reforms were issued, boundaries redrawn, capitals moved. The most symbolic of these acts came from Constantine himself. In 330 AD, he abandoned the ancient capital on the Tiber and founded a new Rome in the east, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It was a declaration that the world had shifted. The center of gravity was moving, away from the aging West, with its decaying temples and shrinking population, toward the vibrant East, where trade, culture, and Christianity thrived. The new Rome was born facing sunrise, not sunset. Constantinople embodied what the old Rome could not admit, that the empire had become too vast, too diverse, too complex to be ruled from one heart. It was an empire divided not only by geography, but by spirit. In the West, the old aristocracy clung to tradition, to paganism, to the memory of marble Rome. In the East, a new order was emerging, Christian, Greek-speaking, bureaucratic, confident in its divine destiny. The empire had split not with a sword, but with a prayer. For a while, it worked. The twin empires, Eastern and Western, coexisted like estranged siblings, each claiming to be the true heir of Rome's eternal mission. But while the East fortified itself behind the golden walls of Constantinople, the West began to crumble. Its provinces, Gaul, Hispania, Britannia, Africa, once engines of wealth, began to drift away. The legions withdrew, the roads fell silent. The outer provinces, cut off from central authority, turned to local warlords and bishops for protection. The idea of Rome, that one law could bind the world, began to fray. Beyond the Rhine and the Danube, restless nations watched the weakening frontier. Goths, Vandals, Franks, Lombards. To Rome, they were barbarians, the nameless, the lawless, the other. But to themselves, they were not destroyers. They were refugees, migrants, survivors of their own storms, drawn toward the fading warmth of empire. At first, they came seeking alliance, trade, shelter. Rome, desperate for soldiers, welcomed them, not as enemies, but as federati, federated allies bound by oath. They fought under Roman banners, wore Roman armor, and dreamed of Roman citizenship. But as the empire weakened, these allies became masters. In 410, the unimaginable happened. The Visigoth king Alaric marched on Rome itself, not to destroy it, but to demand what his people were owed: food, land, dignity. When the city resisted, his army broke through the gates. For 3 days, Rome, the eternal city, the heart of the world, was plundered. Churches looted, homes burned, nobles fled. Saint Jerome, writing from distant Bethlehem, captured the shock that swept across the known world. The city that took the whole world is itself taken. It was more than military defeat. It was psychological collapse. For centuries, Rome had been the axis of the human universe, the place around which time and power revolved. To see it violated was to confront a new truth, that nothing human is eternal. And yet, even as its walls burned, Rome's spirit refused to die. The sack of 410 was not the end, only the beginning of metamorphosis. The empire did not vanish, it fragmented. Authority passed into new hands, new languages, new crowns. The Gothic kings in Italy, the Vandals in Africa, the Franks in Gaul, all claimed to rule in the name of Rome. They minted coins with Roman eagles, governed by Roman law, built cities with Roman plans. They had not destroyed the empire. They had inherited it. In this strange afterlife, Rome became less a place than a principle. To rule meant to be Roman. Civilization itself was now measured by proximity to its memory. But for those who lived through it, the transformation was not philosophical. It was brutal, chaotic, uncertain. Cities depopulated. Trade declined. The long roads cracked and turned to dust. Literacy waned. For many, it must have felt as if the light of the world had gone out. Yet within the ruins, something new was forming. As the empire's political power faded, another power, quieter but more enduring, began to rise. The church, once persecuted, now became the guardian of memory. The bishops who had once prayed for emperors now stood in their place. The clergy became the administrators, teachers, and judges of the new world. The empire of faith replaced the empire of law. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the wake of Rome's sack, gave voice to the new understanding. In his City of God, he argued that no earthly empire, no matter how glorious, could last forever. Only the City of God, built in the soul, was eternal. The fall of Rome, he said, was not the end of history. It was a revelation that human civilization is always provisional, always fragile, always passing through. And so, while the Western Empire fell in 476, when the last emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed, the idea of Rome continued, clothed now in spiritual authority. The Eastern Empire, the Byzantine world, survived for another 1,000 years, carrying the flame of imperial order under a Christian banner. In Constantinople, the emperors still called themselves Romans. Their capital shone with domes and mosaics, their court governed by the same Roman law that had once ruled the Mediterranean. The empire lived on, changed, redefined, but unbroken. Meanwhile, in the West, the memory of Rome became myth. Kings and popes invoked its glory to justify their own. Charlemagne crowned himself Emperor of the Romans. The Holy Roman Empire rose in the name of a city that no longer ruled. In every cathedral, every university, every law court, fragments of Rome endured. The fall of the empire had become the birth of Europe. Yet the transformation was not only political, it was existential. Humanity's vision of time itself changed. The ancient world had believed in cycles, rise and fall, repetition without end. The Christian world that replaced it believed in direction, in salvation, in progress toward eternity. History became a story, not a circle. And at the center of that story still was Rome, now no longer the empire of Caesar, but the empire of Christ. Looking back, it is easy to see decline. But perhaps it is truer to see metamorphosis, the old Rome shedding its skin to become the foundation of the modern world. The Republic's laws became the spine of Western justice. The empire's roads became Europe's trade routes. Its language became the seed of new tongues. Its faith became the moral grammar of civilization. Even its ruins taught something profound, that greatness does not perish, it transforms. When travelers of the Middle Ages stood before the broken arches of the Colosseum, they did not see rubble. They saw a mirror, proof of the fragility of power, but also of its endurance. The stones that once echoed with gladiators now housed monks. The temples once filled with smoke now held candles. The empire that had enslaved the world had become a lesson in humility. Rome had conquered through law, then through faith, and finally through memory. And memory, unlike empire, cannot be sacked. It is said that when the philosopher Boethius was imprisoned, awaiting execution under the Gothic king Theodoric, he found solace not in power, but in wisdom. "Nothing is miserable unless you think it so," he wrote. And on the other hand, nothing brings happiness unless you are content with it. That was Rome's final victory. The transformation of power into thought, of empire into philosophy. From the ruins of its palaces rose universities, monasteries, and libraries. The silent engines of a new civilization. The torch of knowledge, carried through centuries of darkness, still burned with Roman fire. The empire had fallen, yes, but not as a corpse. It had entered history's bloodstream, circulating through every institution, every idea, every dream of order that came after. And perhaps that is what makes Rome immortal. It did not end with a battle or a cataclysm, but with a whisper. The quiet realization that power must evolve or perish. The Romans had once believed their empire was eternal. They were right, but not in the way they imagined. The empire of walls and swords dissolved. The empire of law, language, and spirit endured. Rome's twilight was not its death. It was its transfiguration. The moment when a civilization ceased to be an empire and became an idea. And that idea of unity, of order, of civilization born from chaos, still rules the human mind. Because in every city that rises, in every empire that dreams of eternity, Rome breathes again. When an empire dies, it does not disappear. It becomes a language. It becomes a memory. It becomes the architecture of thought through which the future will speak. Rome, more than any other civilization, refused to fade. It transformed itself into the skeleton of the world that followed, invisible yet indispensable, present in every system that sought to organize the chaos it once ruled. 2,000 years later, its ruins still breathe. The broken columns, the amphitheaters carved into hillsides, the silent aqueducts stretching across valleys, all stand like sentences left unfinished. They do not speak of defeat. They whisper of endurance, of what it means to build something so vast that time itself becomes your only enemy. Rome's true legacy was never its marble, nor its armies, nor its emperors. It was the way it taught humanity to imagine scale, to believe that law could stretch across continents, that identity could transcend birthplace, that order could outlive the men who made it. In Rome, the human mind learned to think globally for the first time. Every civilization since has lived in its shadow. The concept of the state, the citizen, the republic, the empire, all are Roman words, Roman dreams. Every courthouse that invokes justice, every senate that debates the public good, every road that leads to the center of a city, these are echoes of an old rhythm that has never ceased. Even our imagination of decline is Roman. When we speak of the fall of something great, we are really speaking of Rome. It gave the world not just its architecture, but its metaphors. The ruins of the Colosseum, the Latin epitaphs carved in fading stone, they became the universal image of transience, of how glory becomes dust. Rome taught us to see beauty in decay. But beneath the nostalgia lies a more unsettling truth. Rome's legacy is not only noble, it is double-edged. The same empire that built roads and laws also perfected conquest and subjugation. Its discipline became the blueprint for later empires. Spanish, British, even modern ones built not with legions but with economies and networks. The Roman idea of civilization still justifies domination in subtler forms. We inherit not just its wisdom, but its hubris. And yet the fact that we can question Rome at all and that we can analyze its failures, not only celebrate its triumphs, is itself a Roman inheritance. The capacity for self-criticism, for reflection, for the pursuit of truth beyond power, was born in its forums, honed in its philosophies, preserved in its laws. Rome taught us how to think about power and how to doubt it. Its most enduring creation, perhaps, is not empire but memory. Rome made history conscious of itself. The Romans kept records, dates, inscriptions, triumphal arches, not only to boast but to remember. They turned victory into narrative. Even their ruins were deliberate, architecture designed to defy oblivion. When the empire finally fragmented, the memory remained so strong that Europe could not let it go. The Church built its authority upon Roman foundations. The Renaissance revived its art and language. The Enlightenment reinterpreted its law. The modern West built its republics upon its republican myths. Rome's body died, but its mind became immortal. Its greatest paradox is this: The civilization that claimed to last forever achieved eternity not through survival, but through transformation. The empire of territory became an empire of ideas. Rome ceased to exist, and by ceasing, became universal. That universality is what makes it human. Rome is not just a chapter in history, it is a mirror. When we look at it, we see our ambition and our arrogance, our order and our cruelty, our yearning to create something that will endure beyond us. We see ourselves, builders and destroyers both. Perhaps that is why Rome still haunts us, because it reminds us that greatness is never stable. That civilization is always a balance between discipline and decay, between inclusion and control, between vision and violence. The Romans believed that power could impose order upon the world. We, their descendants, still chase that illusion and still wrestle with its consequences. But there is another lesson in Rome's long twilight, that no empire, no system, no structure of power can define the limits of the human spirit. Rome fell, but humanity continued. The fire it lit, the belief that we can build, reason, organize, and endure, burns in every city that rises after ruin. In the end, Rome's meaning is not in what it conquered, but in what it became. A reminder that everything built by human hands carries within it both the seed of destruction and the hope of renewal. And when we stand among its ruins, hearing the echo of our own footsteps on its ancient stones, we understand that the story of Rome is not over. It never ended. It merely changed form, as all great things must, because in every dream of eternity, Rome still lives, and in every fall, Rome still speaks.